Let's think a little bit about what Adichie says in her TED Talk. As she points out, it's important to recognise that as human beings, we all have a tendency to want to categorise and reduce and simplify. But by doing this to our fellow human beings, what she says is that we can dehumanise them and strip them of their dignity. So with Fide's family, they become poor and worthy of pity rather than creative or skilled in producing baskets and so on. So this telling of a single story by the media or government agencies can also be a direct way of exercising power over others. If you can create a single story about someone or a group, control how often that story is repeated, your version becomes the only version. And that stereotyping is dangerous. So it's not that stereotyping or a single story is dangerous because it's not true. It's dangerous because it's incomplete. Having thought about the dangers of a single story and considered the fact that everyone actually has many different aspects to them, we'd like you to take this thinking a little bit further and consider the concept of multiple identities. This is very important when you're going to be working with people in a conflict situation. Reminding ourselves of this will allow us to think of people in a much more nuanced way. Pause the film here and take 15 to 20 minutes to think about who you are in different parts of your life and different circumstances. This exercise is particularly useful to do in a group. So if you are with a study group, then use the study group to encourage much deeper thinking. If you're not, then don't worry, just make sure that you record your answers, and if you can, then talk through it again when you've got a moment with your group.
In the last couple of sessions, we've covered Galton's ABC triangle, which highlighted for us the importance of being aware not just about the behaviours we can see on the surface, but also the attitudes and contexts out of sight, which are always driving different conflict behaviours along. In this session, we're thinking about conflict and culture. And culture is something that sits very much in the attitudes corner of the triangle. So it's where people's values and belief systems are emerging from, a product of their programming from their earliest years. Galton took his triangle a little bit further to think about the difference between conflict and violence. And he put on top of his ABC triangle a number of different aspects of violence that he separated out from conflict. So where he had B for behaviours, he thought of this as direct violence. The violence you can see in the room or hear, the abuse, verbal abuse or physical abuse or attack. Where there was C in the right-hand corner, he thought of that as being structural violence. So where we had context before, he thought about it in terms of the way that the systems and institutions in any given society actually enforced a form of violence which kept others down. We'll come back to that idea later. But in the left-hand corner, where the A was for attitudes, he thought of that as being cultural violence. So the idea that if you lived in an environment where there were majority and mainstream views, for example, these could dominate other people and drown out their voices. And in drowning out their voices, you are actually undermining their ability to reach their full potential, which, as we looked at in the first session, is the definition of violence that we're working with. Linked to the idea then of cultural violence is also an idea of cultural silence. So why do people stay silent and not speak out? Which was very much what the TED Talk was talking about in terms of how people are able to be their full selves. But cultural silence is also something that happens within organisations and groups, where groupthink comes in and takes over, and other viewpoints are not really welcomed or allowed. Going back to that idea of cultural fluency that we had earlier on in this session, what we're thinking about specifically when we're thinking about cultural fluency is how meaning making varies across different cultures. So we looked at the ladder of inference and we thought about how do we individually make our meanings of life. And we can also generalise that to some degree about how different groups in different parts of the world communicate differently or create their own sense of the world. Meaning making emerges in lots of different ways and manifests itself in multiple aspects of how we live our lives. Key ways include how we communicate. Do we rely a lot on the words that are said to us, or do we think about the context that they're said in? Ways of naming, framing, taming conflict, that's a phrase from Le Baron, it's really interesting. When she asked an elderly Chinese man how much conflict he'd experienced in his life, he said very little. He didn't understand the idea of conflict because it wasn't in his Confucian makeup. Identities and roles are incredibly important, but how one culture thinks of the role of mother, for example, can be very different to how another culture does the same. And a last way of thinking about the difference is our relationship to time and also to the sense of narrative that we put onto our lives, a linear, i.e. from A to B to C approach to life and story, or a non-linear one where different aspects are linked up together. Over the next 2 slides, you're going to be looking at some images and thoughts from Aboriginal dream time. What we would like you to do is just take your time to move through those slides and just sit and pause and consider how different they are to the way that you see the world. So you've had a chance now to look at the dream world and to think about that and how different that is to the way that we conceptualise life very often in the West. And I think what's important about this whole session is really coming to grips with the idea that there is no such thing as one truth in the world. There's no right way of being or right way of operating. That all of us come to the world with a sense of what is right for us, our right and our wrong. And so what we're doing is sharing multiple truths. It's important for us to recognise that culture is there in the room with us, even if it's not being talked about, because actually it really is the spice of life. It's the variety that brings so much creativity and dynamism into our world. And it's not something that we would want to ignore. People's culture is very important to them. And in fact, if we choose to approach situations as if we're culture blind, if we ignore it, that does stop people thinking this is for them. Acknowledging people's culture does help them get involved, whatever that culture should be. And we do have to be careful, as the TED Talk pointed out, about reducing people to a single idea. If we can come to grips with the idea of culture, and if we can bring together very diverse workforces, we do face the opportunity of developing really creative and new ways of looking at the world. The trick is going to be, how do we go about finding the way to mesh all the different viewpoints?